So, why are we here? Okay.
It's the season of our joy.
It is. It's the season of our joy. That's what this feast is known as. Of the three feasts, this one is the season of our joy, and we'll see a little bit of that. Our theme for the feast this year has been to focus on the blessing that Aaron was supposed to put on God's people. And so this particular feast, now we're working on, last year we went through and we used the first three of those ideas about bless you and keep you and make his face shine on you and turn his face toward you. And what we want to focus on at Sukkot, since this is the Feast of Harvest, we want to talk about what does it mean to have his name on you. To think of ourselves as being the harvest. It's like in the number 6 blessing, he says he will do all of these things for us. He will bless us. He will turn his face towards us. And having done that, then we become something acceptable. That's the idea of shalom, is that it's this idea of congruence or conformance, however you want to look at that, but you're acceptable. And so when you come to the harvest, what you bring into the barns is what's good. It's what you can use. And so we want to have this harvest mentality. And we want to think about that in the context of, well, what's the relationship of all of these parts of the harvest? Because there are a lot of symbols that are used in the Bible, but the feast symbols, it's the barley harvest at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's the wheat harvest for the Feast of Shavuot. And then this is called the ingathering. It's the harvest of all the crops. And what I hope we can take with us and keep with us is this idea that there aren't just 1 or 2 crops. You know, the instructions were to use the 4 species. Well, they don't grow in our land, so that's always a tough thing to do. But on the other hand, the harvest isn't always finished when we get to Sukkot here either. So we have to adjust for where we are. But I want us to be thinking about, what does that mean? What does it mean to be part of the harvest? Does it mean we're all the same? Are we all little barley kernels? Or, you know? Well, I can tell you, looking at this audience, we're not. So, I mean, think about it. The ingathering includes the fruits and the nuts. Okay, and the flakes. Yeah, there are a few flakes. Yeah, there are some corny things in the harvest. But there's one other thing that I want you to think about. The harvest of each type is always in its season. Okay? If you think back to the song that the birds sang in the 70s about, and it comes from Ecclesiastes, to everything there is a time, and to all things there is a season. Well, harvest is like that. You know, you harvest barley early, wheat's a little bit later. You harvest potatoes in the fall after it's frozen, sugar beets, all those kinds of things. Needs a little frost to sweeten it up. So we need to understand that as God gathers in his harvest, it's not going to be the same for each of us. And we've got to leave room for the harvesters to take the appropriate measures to harvest each type of crop. And so, as we go out and we meet people, as God brings us into contact, recognize that we may not recognize some of the people as being our same species, if you want to think of it that way. And I don't mean Homo sapiens, but just remember that excuse me, barley and wheat are somewhat similar, but grapes have nothing in common with barley and wheat, other than that they've now devised a machine that picks grapes pretty well. But you don't press barley like you do grapes. So there are things like this that we need to understand as God prepares a harvest. The other thing about this particular season is that the first two feasts, we've seen the fulfillment of Passover, Pesach, in Yeshua's sacrifice. Okay, the lamb has been sacrificed. That one's done. Doesn't mean there's nothing to be learned from it, or that each one of us doesn't have our own Pesach experience that we have with each one of the feast cycles. We know that at Shavuot we had the first fruits of the Holy Spirit, but there is a fullness of that harvest yet to come. And I think we're probably in that day. How far along we are in that day, don't know. But I mean, the promise has been made, the Spirit has been given. You know, this is part of the ongoing harvest. And by the way, harvest is not just at Sukkot. Harvest has been going on the whole growing season. Okay, so don't think of this as just a one-time event. This is the culmination of what God is doing, and we're still waiting for that final harvest. Now, we went through the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. That's considered to be the judgment time. So if you made it to Sukkot, you're in pretty good shape. Because if you look at the examples Jesus gave when he talked about the harvest and the wheat and the tares and all of that, if you made it into the barn, then that's a good thing, because the judgment was executed on the tares. So this is a good time. It's part of the reason, like John said, this is the season of our joy, because now we're looking towards the fulfillment. Whatever that is in reality as we experience it, we know it's coming. And for some of us, we'll get to see the whole thing. For some of us, we won't. Pastor we had in Boise said, I can tell you the end is coming in 35 years for me. So he said, the rest of you, you're on your own. And so I want us to be kind of thinking in some of those terms. One of the other things we wanted to focus on is relationships. And we recognize that relationships are what generates strength. You see it in chemical bonds, you see it in nuclear bonds, you see it in structures. It's the relationship between the parts that's used to generate the strength of something. And so we need to recognize that, yes, we are part of the harvest. Some of us may be part of one crop, some of us may be part of different crops. But it's the strength to the body that's the important thing in the harvest. Now, what do you do with harvest? And we talk about Johnny and all the things he has to do when he farms. But one of the things that harvest requires is continual care. You prepare, you plant, you water, you tend. And it's only at the very end that you actually get to harvest. If you quit at any one of those points before there, you get nothing but maybe straw. I mean, you can bale it, but. And so we need to understand that it's, I think it's as Peter says, to persevere. That's the important thing. It's those who persevere that get to the harvest. If you give up in the middle, no harvest. So I want to look at a couple of the instructions that are given. I think it's important that we remind ourselves every so often what the real instructions are, because sometimes we say, oh, well, that was fun, let's do this next time. You know, how about this? And the farther we get away from the understanding of the core instructions, sometimes we start to lose some of the meaning. So I want to read to you from part of Leviticus 23. And I'm going to go back. This is after the instructions for Shavuot are given. When he talks about the wheat harvest and waving the loaves, the first fruits and waving the loaves. And I found this really interesting because I hadn't thought about it. This is an attitude that we're supposed to have as we go through the season of harvest. When you reap the harvest of your land, moreover, you shall not reap the very corners of your field, nor the gleaning of your harvest. You are to leave them for the needy and the alien. I am Yahweh Elohim. Now, there are a couple of things that I think we need to take from that. And it has to do with the purpose of harvest. One of the things about harvest is that it's the evidence of blessing. Obedience yields blessing. When you plant and tend and harvest, the blessing is the yield of that harvest. If you don't see blessing as part of serving in the kingdom, then you're missing one of the great reasons to serve in the kingdom. Because frankly, serving is a lot of work. I mean, if you were to go out and work in the fields and just do it as a job and not care whether there was any harvest or not, pretty much all you'd be is tired. It's the joy that comes from the blessing of seeing obedience rewarded. That's part of the harvest.
Delayed gratification.
Yeah, that's pretty tough in our culture, delayed gratification. It is one of the interesting thoughts is that if you ever had a crisis and people had to go someplace and all there was seed, and you had to plant it and water it and wait for it, there probably wouldn't be a lot of reason to stay there unless you really wanted to be there, because it takes a long time to get a harvest. Okay, harvest, it accomplishes several things. One is it's a resource for the next planting. Okay? The way God designed I'll say the plant world, which is usually what we harvest. I mean, we do it with animals, but differently. But the idea is that you have something from the harvest or the plant that you replant. You plant a seed. And from that grows a plant, which in turn has more seed. And it's this idea of increase. In Matthew, I think it's Matthew 13, he says, the sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, and you know this story, the seeds fell on the different kinds of ground. It was only the good ground that was able to sustain the plant long enough for it to have a yield. And this is where we also need to recognize, it says, some plants yielded 30 times, and some 60 times, and some even 100. Now, the person who sowed the seed didn't make that happen. And so we have to be very careful that we don't look at our harvest, our part of the harvest, and say, my seed's better than your seed. Because it's not. God warns the Israelites multiple times not to think that it's because they're so great and so capable and all of this, to not take it to themselves. And Paul focuses on this several times in his letters. He says, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to. So, when he's talking about who's baptizing who, apparently that was like the numbers game in Corinth. Says, I don't care who baptized who, as long as people are coming to the Messiah. So we need to recognize that as servants in the kingdom, as field hands, if you want to think of yourself that way, that we have a job to do. And what we want is to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into my rest. Because the harvest belongs to the Lord. And even if we helped create it, it's not ours. Now, he gives it back to us as we need it. If we need to plant it, he gives us some to plant. If we need to eat it, he makes it available to us to sustain us. So we need to recognize this role of the yield of the harvest and what our part is in it. So the part about not sowing or not reaping your fields to the edges, don't keep it all for yourself. The part that you keep for yourself will rot. We need to be ready to put it all in the barn and let the Father give us back the part we need. That's humility. By the way, humility comes from the word for earth, humus, from dust to dust. It's not groveling in the dirt. It's just recognizing the reality of who we are, who God made us. So here's kind of another concept. When we started farming over there, I started to realize as I was following my dad around pulling weeds out of alfalfa, that there's a difference between farming and gardening. Gardening is about the plant. God is the consummate gardener. He cares about every plant. Farming is about the field. Fields are composed of the same kind of plant. God tells us not to plant two kinds of seed in the same ground because that leads to a contaminated harvest. We have to be careful what we do with that particular instruction. But recognize that there are fields. And if we want to translate that into, say, personal relationships, family relationships, and we're going to focus a lot on families, clans, tribes, nations, because this feast is about the nations also. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So you have fields. Think of fields as maybe families. We're all related. We have similar needs and circumstances, and we interact with each other. I mean, that's the way ancestry and progeny works. So if fields are like families, then a crop is the accumulation of all the like harvests. So you would put barley in a Quonset hut to save it. And you might grind wheat into flour so that you could make bread or whatever you're going to do with it. And you'd put grapes, you'd process those, you'd squeeze them, you'd make the juice out of them, you'd make wine, whatever you were going to make out of those grapes. And so we need to recognize that as these crops come in, because typically crops are in their season, they'll come from lots of different directions. If you were to take all of the harvest in this valley and bring it to one central point, it would pretty much occur at the same time. You'd have the barley coming in at one time. You'd have alfalfa coming in as the crops were harvested, but it's a multi-harvest crop. If there was lots of fruit around, you'd have the fruit coming in at the same time, the vegetables from the garden. Hopefully we can get some sense that it's going to require understanding as well as tolerance to have all of these different cropping activities going on throughout the period that we're called to be servants in the kingdom here. Now, in the instructions, he goes on then, he says, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel. On the 15th of the 7th month is the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, for 7 days to Yahweh." So we're in the middle of an appointed time, a moed. 7 days we're supposed to be living in these booths. Now, I got to admit, that deck out there was a pretty nice booth. Now, it's not very portable, but it is temporary. And we get to enjoy that for this time of our observing the feast. It says, "On the first day is a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work of any kind." This is a recognition that your provision comes from Yahweh. He's the one who created it. He knows how it works. He can provide. It says, "For 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to Yahweh. On the 8th day you'll have a holy convocation and present an offering by fire. It is an assembly. You shall do no laborious work." So we have this 8-day period. And we recognize from the days, the cycles that God gives us, that the 8th day is a new beginning. A cycle of 7 with a new beginning. So we look forward to the 8th day. We don't know what it is. but we know it's going to be good. Because after God accomplishes whatever his cycle is in the 7 days, then he says, all right, you're ready to do a new thing. And we need to be prepared both in our minds and in our, I guess I would rather say in our desires, to want the 8th day. A lot of people are afraid of the unknown. And it's interesting because you'll hear people say, my God is so great, my God is so mighty, there's nothing he cannot do, but I'm afraid of the 8th day. That one's a little inconsistent. Okay, so in Deuteronomy 16 then, he goes on and he essentially reiterates the same instructions. He says, Yahweh your God will bless you in all your produce and all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful. So, don't get too somber here. This is, we want to be careful that we don't take humor to the extreme. This is not a time to be tight-lipped and sad or whatever else. This is the best it gets in the cycles of God's appointed times. And we ought to take advantage of that. Interact with each other. Tell stupid jokes. Really. Sense of humor will go a long ways. I really wish some of that was written in the Bible, but I think it would have totally distracted us, what Jesus had to say. Anyway, he goes on to say that 3 times a year all your males shall appear before Yahweh Elohim in the place he chooses. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks or Shavuot, the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, Sukkot. And they shall not appear before me empty-handed. Now, what does it mean to be empty-handed? He explains a little. He says, every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of Yahweh Elohim, which he has given you. And we understand that Israel was instructed with a system of tithes and offerings, first fruits, fellowship. There were all kinds of opportunities to give. And God always made provision so that there was a sacrifice that was within your means that was acceptable. And so we need to give away, get rid of, bury this idea that we don't have enough or anything good enough to give. Now, this idea of coming empty-handed, it's the same word that's used in Exodus 20, where it says, if I can find it, I probably don't need to find it. It says, you shall not take Yahweh's name in vain. That word vain means empty, and in this case empty-handed, or it means without purpose. And as we come back to the number 6 blessing, where it says, the sons of Aaron will put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Think about what it means to take that name without purpose. It's not swearing, by the way. I don't encourage you to swear, but give up the idea that it has anything to do with swearing. This is a functional instruction. If you are going to assemble yourselves with a people who have the name of Yahweh on them, then you have responsibilities and you have equivalent opportunities to be blessed in obedience. If you take his name in vain, it's what's talked about in the New Testament about essentially grieving the Holy Spirit, because you have either not recognized or you have treated as nothing the value of having his name. And in the context of harvest, in any food processing operation, there's a bypass. And there's a quality control check, and what doesn't make quality control check goes in the trash. And that's what God is trying to tell us. Don't end up in the trash. I'm giving you every opportunity to be the good stuff. Don't end up in the trash. And he says, and by the way, unless you really oppose me, I will make sure you don't end up in the trash. Okay? So we need to be very clear about what God has offered us and what he requires of us. So this is the opportunity we have to celebrate some of these concepts. And one of the things, stuff comes to me in weird ways. But how many of you ever bought an apple in a grocery store and it had one of those little stickers on it? You know? Who'd like a fruit sticker? You want one, Britton? You want one, Ella? Come on up, come on up. Now, I don't have 1,000,000 of these. I will tomorrow. All right. So where would you like the sticker? Right there? Okay. Who else wants one? Go show that around. Come here, Clara. I couldn't find a UPC code for Yahweh. Let's see, I got to find one that's centered. Some of these were my rejects, but you're not. This is quality control. All the bad ones go in the trash. Where do you want it? On your shirt? There we go. Go show those around. You want one? Yeah, I figured you would. Blessed are you, O highly competitive person. You want one? Can I put it on your forehead?
Unless you become like a little child, you never enter.
Where would you like it?
Right there.
There we go. Now think about it. We're told in Revelation that in the end times that people will take them on themselves the mark of the beast. I believe that's the choice. You're either going to have the name of Yahweh on you, and it's not going to be physically obvious, but we're told that we're to be light. Or you're going to have the mark of the beast. That's the wheat and the tares. And we need to recognize what that means in the long run. Because short term, we're always discouraged and disappointed, right? You know, unrealistic expectations, selfish treatment from other people. You can blame all kinds of things. So if you can keep the long view in your head and let the rest of it just run off, which you may need help from other people to do, by the way. I mean, I'm not immune from this kind of stuff. But you need people to come along and say, you know, you need to be propped up because your yield is not what it could be. Okay? You're going to damage yourself in the process. And so we need a lot of help. That's part of the reason, by the way, that pine trees and grain-type crops grow closely together. It helps protect the plants. So you need to be close together with like kind of your crop. There's a lot of protection in the way God has arranged us to be growing. So don't get out on your own. Those are the ones who get picked off. Just watch one of those animal videos about the hunting lions in Africa. All right, it's not the people in the middle of the herd that get nailed. So, and we know the stories that Jesus, or the examples Jesus gave about vines and branches. You know, who here likes pruning? Is that an exciting concept to you? Yeah, depends on where you are. But recognize, we're all going to get a little pruning. You know, if the chief of the vineyard looks at you and says, your fruit is being impacted by this thing that's growing on you, I am going to get rid of it. He will. Because he promised. That's the problem that we have in counting on his faithfulness. is that he will get us there. Yes. I like the example in 1 Corinthians 3 where he talks about the man who's really not living a very good life, but he's trying, and he says he'll go into heaven smelling like smoke. But he made it. That's the first objective, is to make it. Okay, avoid the trash. So as we go through this weekend, let's look at each other in the sense of being related. We are a harvest. James tells us that it'll yield a harvest of righteousness if we live according to God's instructions. And so in a way we are a harvest. We are the yield of the Messiah being planted and raised again. But we are also the workers in the field. There is a lot of harvest to be done out there. And all of that harvest, and I'll use the grain analogy, is available to be planted, to die, and grow and yield more fruit. And we need to understand that that's part of our role, is to keep this process going that God has ordained so that the entire creation has the opportunity to be in his presence. That's what he wants. And granted, he didn't explain it all to us, but we know enough to say, I'm hanging in there. And so, if we live the lives we're supposed to, there will be other people who will become part of the harvest. And that really is just a testament to what living as light is about. And that's what God called us to do. That's what Yeshua is our example for, is to live as light so that the harvest can be abundant. So, as far as the rest of this weekend, and I'm not going to keep you here a whole lot longer, we're going to go out on the deck tonight and we're going to experience a little Sukkot time. I got to ask, how many of you listened to Creedence Clearwater Revival at some point? Okay. How many of you know the song Bad Moon Rising? Okay. So I was coming over here last night for our observance, and I was looking for the full moon. And I know God has a sense of humor, because here's what came into my head. I see the full moon horizon. I see the sukkahs in the town. I see God's people stand to praise him. I see the Spirit coming down. Let's go out tonight. We want to see the light. I see the full moon on the rise. And I said, yes, now I know why I listened to all of that when I was a kid. But it's absolutely true. That's what we're after. We're looking for the light. We want to be blessed in our obedience. We want to assemble when he tells us to come into his presence. And we are blessed because of it. So let's do that this weekend. We'll go out tonight. We'll enjoy some fellowship time. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning, we're going to have a brunch meal. At noon, we'll assemble over here for a daily sacrifice communion service. And then tomorrow afternoon, Jerry Childs and mostly Jerry, Jerry's going to be taking pictures and printing them. What we want to do is get pictures of everybody who's here. I'm going to be building a tape tree on the wall, back north wall of the center, and we're going to hang all these up there. And it's going to be the family tree, and it's going to start with Yeshua, and it'll have all the tribes of Israel by name on it. But we want to do those associated with Levi at this point, just because that's who we are. And the exercise that I hope we can do is to identify above us who's not here, but on whose shoulders we stand, and go down below that to identify anybody else that we're aware of that ought to be on that tree. We just don't have a picture. Okay? Because what we want to do is see the strength of this part of the harvest. We want to know who each other is, where they come from. the more we know about each other, the more likely we are to appreciate how we can help each other. And that's where our strength is. If we don't know anything about each other, impersonal relationships yield no strength. In fact, some of the research, psychological research that I saw lately said that your willingness to defend somebody is processed in a part of your cerebral cortex that identifies whether or not that person is part of your group or is outside your group. And part of the way that so many of these despicable events have gone on in history, where ethnic cleansing has gone on and some of these other kinds of things, is because the enemy knows how to use that against us. He convinces us that those who are not in our group are bad. And it enables us to make that moral judgment that they can be destroyed. We cannot think that way in the kingdom. All the harvest comes into the same barn. It may look different, but the master wants it there. So we need to be careful to develop our relationships in a positive way. One of the Levitical writings says, "Seek for your brother that which you would have for yourself." That requires you to know your brother. And it requires you to know yourself. And that's what we hope to be able to do, is to deepen our understanding of each other in terms of our relationships. I would hope we would be able to maybe extend our sense of hospitality a little bit in the idea of talking with people that you don't know. We have a tendency to stay in our little core groups, and usually they're family groups, because families fight with each other a lot and they know each other really well. And some of them they know where the hot buttons are to push. They meet somebody they don't know where to push the button. But let's see if we can work on that a little bit. In the community it gets pretty tight. But still, I suspect there are people who don't know each other in the community as well as they ought to. And certainly for those of us who don't live here, it's an opportunity for us to get to know people better. Even just, I was looking at Brianna today. Yeah, she's looking up now. And I thought, she hiked up to Mount Aaron with Arlo and I think when she was either 8 or 9. And that's about the last time that I really interacted with her. So, think about how long it's been since you actually talked to somebody. And take an opportunity to say, how are you doing? What's been going on in your life? And maybe even explain to them what's been going on in yours. I don't know about you, but I find it really easy to ask other people questions about themselves, but I don't let them squeeze very much out of me. Unless the mic's open, and then I'll talk all night. But take the opportunities to build some relationships. I'm hoping that we'll have some people come down from Partone. Some of you may not even have a clue who they are. Ask them. Just do that basic first social interaction step. And then tomorrow evening we'll have dinner at 5:45, and then we're going to have another event out on the deck, our Sukkot for this season. And you'll just have to wait to see what happens at that one. I haven't decided yet, actually. We could turn that deck into a bowling alley. That might be fun, do table bowling. But I have some things I want to try. And we'll pass out a few more fruit stickers for those of you who'd like some. But then Sunday morning we're going to have, and this obviously isn't exactly on the 8th day, but if you remember the instructions, it says on the 8th day, have another solemn assembly. And we're going to try and reflect that 8th day celebration on Sunday morning with praise and worship, music, presentations, whatever John is dreaming up for that one. So, again, let's think of ourselves as the harvest. Maybe different crops, but I'm thinking that if God is a chef, he can take all those different pieces and make something really wonderful out of them. I mean, that wasn't half bad tonight, just for our opening. So thank you guys and everybody else who worked on it. Who doesn't like to eat? And feasts are great for that. So I think that's really about all I'm gonna do tonight. But I would like for you all to stand. Oh, there was one other thing before you stand up. There's one other concept, and this one got by me because my blessing sheet covered up the other piece of paper. There are two perspectives at this feast. And actually, there are two perspectives at every feast. It's what went on at the temple and the priests in their administration, the sacrifices that they had to make. There was an official nature of sacrifice in the temple in each feast. But the people had their own requirements. And I want us to think about that because we are a nation, which we could think of maybe as a crop. And as a nation, God says, I have a way that I deal with you as a nation. But he says, as people, this is what I want you to do. I want you to live in these booths. I want you to remember what happened when you came out of Egypt and how Yahweh Elohim cared for you. And I want you to bring evidence of the blessing that he's given you over this season. So we have, as individuals, responsibilities because Yahweh's name is on us. And we have, as a nation, ministry that's essential for us as a whole people. And so we need to recognize those two things are going on at the same time. At Sukkot, there were special offerings that were made. And as we look at this, I'm pretty much in agreement that this has to do with the bringing in of all the nations. See, Israel, because of Yom Kippur, Israel has been judged. Okay? And so if you look at the sacrifices for the 7 days that are prescribed for Sukkot, you have a sin offering, a goat, every day, just one. You have 14 lambs that are offered every day, 2 times 7. I find that significant. You have 2 rams, which are usually associated with the priests and the kings and, the leaders. And you have a total of 70 bulls. And those are the 70 nations, at least in Jewish counting, that God created in the whole earth. And so as we look towards the fullness of Sukkot, and you can think that this might be a ways down the road, but don't plan that way. God's got to gather Israel back together first. I mean, he's got a scattered Ephraim, he's got Judah who doesn't know the Messiah. And if we're going to fulfill Hosea's prophecies and a lot of the others so that Ephraim can be the arrow in the bow of Judah, there's a lot of work to be done there. Once that's accomplished, if you read through Isaiah and Ezekiel and look at what goes on, you see that the nations come to Jerusalem. They are not Israel. And so think about what it might mean to have all nations acceptable before Yahweh. Because that defines another ministry for Israel. So we want to be thinking in big terms. Think big. There used to be an army slogan that said, be all you can be. And really that's what God wants. He says, I know all that you could be. And if you want it, I'll make it possible. So, seek and you shall find. And so, let's seek some relationships and find those, and then we'll be stronger as a people. So, if you'll all stand, I'd like to offer the blessing on the sons of Israel. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh turn his face toward you and give you his shalom. So the sons of Aaron will put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them. In the name of our Messiah, Yeshua. Amen. All right. let's go to the deck, and as you were supposed to do at every feast, enjoy the good things. John?
Yes, at 9 o'clock tomorrow, we have lunch at 10. I would like a few hardy, strong souls to help bring the sanctuary servants.
Furnishings, articles.
So, do some of,
9 o'clock, assemble here or over there?
yeah, either.
Okay.
Welcome.
All right.
We're looking for muscles.
I think we have to say Sukkot Shalom this time.